There is a quiet baseball field in Pittsburgh's Lawrenceville neighborhood where a federal arsenal once stood. On the afternoon of September 17, 1862, the same day as the bloodiest battle of the Civil War at Antietam, three massive explosions ripped through the arsenal's main laboratory. 78 workers died. Most were women and girls. Some were only 14 years old. 54 bodies were never identified and buried together in a single mass grave. The military cleared everyone responsible. Congress refused to pay compensation to the families. As we uncover the full story of its dramatic rise and fiery fall, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you love stories of industrial empires, tragic disasters, and the hidden chapters of American history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. The story of the Allegheny Arsenal does not begin with weapons. It begins with a real estate deal. The War of 1812 had taught the federal government a lesson it would not forget. American soldiers had marched west into the Ohio Valley with muskets that misfired, powder that arrived damp, and ammunition that came from private contractors scattered across the eastern seaboard. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles through forests and over mountains. When the British burned Washington in August of 1814, the message was clear. The young republic needed federal arsenals positioned closer to the frontier, capable of arming the army before the army was already dying. Pittsburgh sat at the perfect point on the map. Three rivers met at the city: the Allegheny flowing from the north, the Monongahela from the south, and the Ohio carrying everything west into the heart of the continent. Iron foundries had been operating in the surrounding hills since the 1790s. Coal seams ran beneath the riverbanks. Skilled labor flowed in from German and Scotch-Irish communities that had settled the western valleys 2 generations earlier. If the federal government wanted to build a weapons factory that could arm the Western Army, Pittsburgh was the obvious choice. Here's the thing about how the federal government actually selected the site. No record survives of alternative sites being seriously evaluated. No competing bids from landowners along the Allegheny River appear in the War Department files. The government bought 38 acres from one man, William Barclay Foster, at a price Foster found very satisfactory. Foster was a Pittsburgh merchant, politician, and land speculator. He had served in the Pennsylvania state legislature. He had connections in Washington. He owned a strip of farmland on the north bank of the Allegheny, roughly 2 miles upriver from the city center, in what was then the village of Lawrenceville. The land was pleasant enough. It was also, conveniently for Foster, exactly the kind of riverside parcel the War Department had decided it wanted. The sale closed in 1814. Foster collected his profit. Within months, federal contractors were breaking ground on the first brick buildings. The powder magazine went up that same year. Squat, thick-walled, designed to contain a blast if its contents ignited. The powder magazine still stands today. The city of Pittsburgh uses it as a maintenance shed for the baseball diamond that now occupies the Arsenal grounds. The building outlived the institution it was built to serve. It outlived the man who sold the land. It outlived the children who would die 200 yards from its walls. Picture this: a federal weapons factory on land, bought from a politically connected speculator, in a residential village, in a state where the federal presence was negligible, run for the convenience of the people who profited from its existence rather than the people who depended on its product. That was the Allegheny Arsenal in 1814. The pattern was set on the deed. Here is the kicker about William Barclay Foster. His son, born in Lawrenceville in 1826, within sight of the arsenal his father had founded, would grow up to become Stephen Collins Foster, the most famous American songwriter of the 19th century. Stephen Foster wrote "Oh, Susanna." He wrote "Camptown Races." He wrote "My Old Kentucky Home" and "Beautiful Dreamer" and "Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair." His songs would become the soundtrack of an entire era of American sentiment, performed by minstrel troops from New Orleans to Boston, sung by Union and Confederate soldiers alike around their campfires. Stephen Foster wrote the music America used to remember itself. His father wrote the deed that put a federal arsenal in a residential neighborhood. Construction continued through the 1820s. The arsenal expanded. By the 1830s, it was producing gun carriages, leather goods, harnesses, and the brass and iron fittings needed to keep Western Army units supplied. Cartridge production began as a secondary function and grew steadily. The facility hosted notable visitors over the decades. President James Monroe came through. The Marquis de Lafayette, on his celebrated American tour of 1824, was given an inspection. Charles Dickens visited during his 1842 American journey. Former President John Quincy Adams toured the grounds. The arsenal accumulated a sheen of national prestige, the kind of federal institution that politicians pointed to as evidence of American industrial seriousness. The prestige was real. The foundation was a real estate deal. Through the 1830s and 1840s, the Allegheny Arsenal remained a quiet, mid-sized federal facility. Roughly 200 men worked the grounds in peacetime. The commanding officer rotated through the Ordnance Corps every few years. Professional officers cycled through arsenals across the country as part of standard military career rotation. Some were competent administrators. Some were forgettable. None of them stayed long enough to fundamentally change how the place operated. The institution ran on momentum, on tradition, on the assumption that a federal arsenal built on bought land would continue to function the way federal arsenals always had. The command of the arsenal would eventually pass to Colonel John Symington in 1857, a 45-year career officer of the Ordnance Corps, professional in every credential the federal government could offer. He had commanded arsenals from St. Louis to Watervliet, New York. He was no patronage appointee. He arrived in Pittsburgh with a service record stretching back to 1815. The credentials did not save the children. Symington arrived at the Allegheny Arsenal in 1857 with the kind of resume the Ordnance Corps cultivated over a lifetime. He had entered the Army in 1815, graduated 6th in his West Point class, served as an assistant inspector of foundries, and commanded arsenals in St. Louis, Washington, and Watervliet, New York. He sat on the Ordnance Board for nearly 2 decades. He was promoted to major in 1842, to colonel in 1861. By any measure the federal government used to evaluate its officers, John Symington was a professional. He was not a political reward handed to a campaign donor. He was the system working as designed. The arsenal he inherited employed roughly 200 men. They produced gun carriages, leather goods, harnesses, brass and iron fittings, percussion caps, and ammunition for the Western Army. The work was steady, the pay was adequate, and the institutional culture was the kind a career officer recognized. Solid, predictable, unspectacular. Cartridge production was a secondary function in those years. The arsenal turned out perhaps a few thousand rounds per day, enough to supply frontier garrisons and replenish the limited combat operations against native populations in the plains and Southwest. Then Fort Sumter fell. In April of 1861, the United States went from a peacetime army of 16,000 men to a wartime army that would eventually number over 2 million. Every one of those soldiers needed a musket. Every musket needed cartridges. The federal arsenal system, which had spent decades producing ammunition at a leisurely rate for a small standing army, suddenly faced demand that multiplied tenfold in a matter of months. By the summer of 1861, the Allegheny Arsenal was producing tens of thousands of cartridges per day. By the summer of 1862, it would be producing more than 100,000. The number would climb to 128,000 cartridges per day in the months before the explosion. Cartridge production in the 1860s was almost entirely manual. A finished paper cartridge was a small cylinder of folded paper. glued at one end, containing a measured charge of black powder and a lead ball. The work required nimble fingers, attention to detail, and the patience to repeat the same motion thousands of times per shift. The arsenal needed workers who could do this work quickly, cheaply, and without complaint. The federal government had been buying that powder by the ton from a single contractor for decades. The arsenal started by hiring teenage boys. The decision made sense on paper. Boys were smaller than men, paid less than men, and abundant in a city like Pittsburgh, where working-class families needed every wage their children could bring home. By mid-1861, the laboratory buildings were filled with boys aged 12 to 17, rolling cartridges by the thousand, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. They earned roughly half what a man earned for the same output. They were considered ideal labor. They were not ideal labor. Workers at the arsenal began finding matches in the powder rooms. Not once, repeatedly. The boys were tobacco smokers. They carried matches in their pockets and pulled them out reflexively when they wanted to light a cigarette during a break or sneak a smoke between tasks. The powder rooms contained loose black powder by the barrel. A match in a powder room was a death sentence waiting for the right moment. On at least 2 occasions, matches were found packed inside finished cartridges destined for Union soldiers at the front. Whether the boys had hidden them as pranks, or had accidentally left them on the workbench where they got rolled into the paper, or had done it deliberately for reasons no one ever ascertained, the result was the same. Federal ammunition was being shipped to the Army with embedded incendiary devices that could detonate inside a soldier's cartridge box. Symington had to act. In October of 1861, 6 months into the war, he made the decision that would define the arsenal's identity for the rest of its existence. He dismissed the boys and, in his own phrase, decided to supply their places with females. The framing mattered. Symington did not present the decision as exploitation. He presented it as discipline. Women and girls, he believed, would not smoke. They would not carry matches. They would not engage in the kind of reckless behavior that put the entire facility at risk. They would do the work he needed done, manner he needed it done, without the supervisory headaches the boys had created. He was not entirely wrong about the discipline. After women entered the powder rooms, Symington reported no further incidents involving matches. The call for female applicants went out in October. The response was immediate. Pittsburgh in 1861 was a working-class industrial city. Wages were tight. Husbands and fathers were enlisting in Union regiments and leaving households without breadwinners. A federal job at the arsenal, even at half a man's wage, was a lifeline. Within weeks, women and girls began arriving at the laboratory gates looking for work. By the summer of 1862, 156 women and girls were employed at the Allegheny Arsenal. The youngest was 10 years old. Most were between 12 and 17. A few were in their 20s. They came from the immediate neighborhood, Lawrenceville, the surrounding wards, the row houses along the streets that climbed up the hillside from the river. Many were the daughters of arsenal workers in other departments. Some were the sole wage earners in households where the father had gone to war and not yet come home. The conditions were industrial. The women worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. They earned between 50 cents and $1.10 per day, depending on speed and tenure. Each worker had a daily quota based on her individual production history. A girl who failed to meet quota could be dismissed without notice. There was no time off for illness, no pay for missed days, no protection against arbitrary firing. Picture this: a laboratory building filled with rows of wooden benches, each bench occupied by a girl no older than 15, her hair tied back to keep it out of the powder. She measures a charge from an open container at her elbow. She folds a paper tube around the powder and the lead ball. She twists the end. She sets the finished cartridge aside. She reaches for the next paper tube. She does this 300 times every hour. She does it for 12 hours. At the end of her shift, if she met quota, She collects $1 and walks home through streets where her neighbors are doing the same work in their own kitchens for husbands at the front. This was production. This was discipline. This was the system Symington had built to keep matches out of his powder rooms. It would keep matches out. It would not keep sparks out. The conditions were already known to the federal government. They were known to the contractors who supplied the powder. They were known to the laboratory supervisors who watched the women work each day. One of those supervisors was beginning to write letters of his own. His name was Alexander McBride, and he understood barrels better than any man at the Allegheny Arsenal. McBride was a Pittsburgh civilian, not an Army officer. He had been trained as a cooper, the centuries-old trade of building wooden barrels, kegs, and casks. A cooper learned to shape oak staves, set iron hoops, fit lids that sealed against weather and pressure. The craft required understanding how wood breathed, how grain swelled and shrank with moisture, how a barrel built to hold whiskey could not be repurposed to hold flour without leaking. A trained cooper could look at a powder keg, run his hand along its seam, lift its lid, and tell you in 30 seconds whether it was safe to ship. McBride had been hired as superintendent of the main laboratory. He oversaw cartridge production, managed the women and girls at the benches, and signed off on the powder supplies that arrived each week from the federal contractor. The contractor was the E.I. DuPont Company. DuPont was already the largest and most established gunpowder manufacturer in the United States. Founded in 1802 along the Brandywine River in Delaware, it had supplied the federal government through the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and every smaller conflict in between. By 1861, DuPont was the nation's primary black powder source, with federal contracts that ran into the millions of pounds. The company shipped its powder in standardized wooden kegs, each holding 25 pounds, sealed with a wooden lid clamped down by iron hoops. Here's the thing about wooden powder kegs in the 1860s. They were expensive to produce. The oak had to be seasoned. The staves had to be cut with precision. The hoops had to be forged. A new keg cost the company real money. So DuPont, like every supplier in every industry, looked for ways to control costs. The most obvious savings came from reusing the kegs after their first delivery. Sending them back from the arsenals, refilling them, shipping them out again. McBride knew what reused kegs meant. He had built barrels for a living before he ever worked at an arsenal. He knew that oak staves, once they had been stressed by an initial load of powder and shipped over rough roads, never returned to their original tightness. The wood compressed slightly, the seams loosened. The lids, clamped and unclamped repeatedly, no longer sat flush against the rim. When a reused keg was shipped from Delaware to Pittsburgh, jostled on rail cars and wagons for hundreds of miles, fine black powder worked its way out through the gaps. By the time the keg arrived at the arsenal gate, a noticeable trail of loose powder had often spilled along the wagon bed and onto whatever surface the keg crossed during unloading. McBride wrote to his superiors. He complained to Symington. He pointed out, in the language of a man who had spent his career building the things in question, that DuPont's insistence on reusing kegs was creating a steady accumulation of loose powder across the arsenal grounds. The lids did not fit, the seams leaked. Every shipment dropped grains of black powder onto the roadways, the loading platforms, the laboratory porches. The complaints went into the file. The kegs kept arriving. In 1861, Symington made a separate decision that would multiply McBride's concerns. He ordered a macadamized road built between the powder magazine and the main laboratory. Macadam was a relatively new road-building technique imported from Britain, named for the Scottish engineer John Macadam. It used layers of crushed angular stone, compacted into a hard surface that drained well and held up under wagon traffic. The Allegheny Arsenal needed reliable road surfaces for the heavy wagons that moved powder kegs and finished cartridges between buildings. Macadam was the modern solution. The problem was the stone. Macadamized roads were built from hard, angular fragments, granite, basalt, flint, whatever local quarries supplied. The fragments had sharp edges. They were specifically chosen to interlock under pressure, rather than wash away with rain. They also struck sparks when iron met them at speed. Picture this: a wagon loaded with reused DuPont powder kegs, pulled by iron-shod horses, rolling across a road surfaced with flinty stone, leaving a trail of loose powder behind it. Every hoof strike was a potential ignition source. Every iron wheel rim grinding against angular rock was a spark waiting to find fuel. Experienced workers at the arsenal saw it immediately. McBride saw it. He ordered sawdust and wood chips spread across the macadamized road between the magazine and the laboratory to cushion the stone and prevent metal contact with bare rock. Symington ordered the sawdust swept away. The reason was operational. Sawdust attracted vermin, gummed up when wet, made the road harder to maintain. Symington was a career ordnance officer who valued clean facilities and standardized procedures. A road surfaced with stone, free of debris, met his definition of professional. A road covered in sawdust and chips did not. He overruled his civilian supervisor and instructed the grounds crew to keep the macadam clear. McBride made one more request. He asked Symington for permission to give the women workers a half-day off on a Saturday so they could go out onto the road with brooms and clear away the accumulated powder that had spilled from kegs over weeks of deliveries. The cleanup would take half a shift. It would cost the arsenal a few $100s in lost wages and a small reduction in cartridge output for that week. Symington refused. Production could not stop. The Union Army was consuming cartridges faster than the arsenal could ship them. Every hour the laboratory was idle was an hour Union soldiers might run short of ammunition. The Saturday cleanup would have to wait until things slowed down. Things did not slow down. Here is the thing about Symington that complicates the story. Rumors had been circulating in Pittsburgh for months about his loyalty. His son had joined the Confederate Army. His daughter had appeared at a Lawrenceville church service wearing a Confederate rosette pinned to her dress, and the gossip had spread through every neighborhood within walking distance of the arsenal. Whether the rumors had any bearing on Symington's professional decisions is impossible to say with certainty. He had given the Army 4.5 decades of service. He had no record of sabotage or disloyalty. He had, by every paper measure, performed his duty. But the rumors existed. They would matter later. For now, in the summer of 1862, the system Symington had built was running at full capacity. 156 women and girls at their benches, 128,000 cartridges per day. Reused DuPont kegs with loose lids spilling powder onto a macadamized road of sharp stone. Iron-shod horses crossing that road dozens of times each day. A civilian superintendent who had written every warning he knew how to write and been overruled at every turn. The sun rose over Lawrenceville on the morning of September 17, 1862. It was warm. The sky was clear. The air was dry. The women walked to work. The late summer sun shone brightly on the two armies battling along Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862. The bloodiest day of fighting in the Civil War. Some 175 miles to the west, the sun shone on the Allegheny Arsenal as well. In a Maryland cornfield, Union and Confederate soldiers were killing each other in numbers that would not be matched on American soil for the rest of the nation's history. In a brick laboratory in Pittsburgh, 156 women and girls were rolling cartridges to keep that killing supplied. The morning had begun like every other morning. The workers arrived at the gate before 7 o'clock. They were checked in, assigned to their benches, and given their daily quotas. By 8 in the morning, the rhythm of production had set in. The soft sound of paper folding, the click of measuring cups against powder, the steady murmur of women working 12 feet apart in long rows, Catherine Burkhart was 15 years old. She lived at 184 38th Street, a few blocks from the Arsenal gate. She walked to work that morning the way she walked every morning. Margaret Turney was 17. She lived at 160 43rd Street. The two girls were among the 156 at the benches by mid-morning. Neither of them knew the other was there. The laboratory was large. The work was loud enough to discourage conversation. Katie McBride was 14 years old. Her father was Alexander McBride, the superintendent of the laboratory, the man who had spent the last year writing warnings about reused powder kegs and macadamized roads. Katie worked at a bench inside the same building her father supervised. He was on the grounds that morning. He had been on the grounds every working day for over a year. He had every warning in the file. He could not have predicted that the warnings would arrive for his daughter first. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a DuPont wagon pulled up to deliver a fresh shipment of powder to the magazine. The kegs were the usual reused barrels. The road was the usual macadamized surface. The horses were the usual iron-shod team. No one on the wagon, no one at the gate, no one in the laboratory noticed anything unusual. A horseshoe struck a flinty stone, or an iron wheel rim ground against a sharp fragment of granite. The exact source has never been determined. What is known is that a spark ignited loose powder that had spilled from a leaking keg onto the macadamized road in front of the laboratory porch. The spark traveled along the trail of powder into the building. The first explosion ripped through the porch and the front rooms of the laboratory. Symington was in his quarters when he heard it. He ran out the door and started uphill toward the laboratory. He had not covered half the distance when the second explosion went off. He kept running. The third explosion came a moment later. By the time he reached the laboratory, the building was a pile of smoldering rubble, and the air was full of the sound of small arms ammunition cooking off in the fire. This is the detail the official reports tended to skip. The Arsenal had been producing finished cartridges all morning. Crates of completed rounds had been stacked in the laboratory awaiting shipment. When the explosions ignited the building, they also ignited tens of thousands of those cartridges. Survivors who had escaped the initial blast, women with their clothes burning, girls with shrapnel in their faces, workers crawling out of collapsed walls, found themselves under a barrage of their own product. Lead balls whistled in every direction. Powder charges popped continuously for over an hour as the fire worked its way through the stockpile. A bucket brigade formed from the surrounding buildings and from the Arsenal workshops that had not been hit. The volunteer fire company from Pittsburgh arrived as quickly as horses could pull the engines from downtown. The blast had been heard over 2 miles away. Windows had shattered in Lawrenceville houses, on streets where workers' families were eating their midday meals. By the time the fire was brought under control, the laboratory had been reduced to a heap of smoking brick and twisted iron. 78 workers were dead. Over 150 more were wounded, many of them with burns and lacerations that would leave them disfigured for the rest of their lives. Alexander McBride found his daughter in the ruins. Part of the laboratory's flaming ceiling had collapsed onto the room where Katie had been working. She was 14 years old. The next morning, September 18th, Colonel Symington wrote his official report to the Ordnance Department in Washington. He cataloged the losses with the precision of a career officer accounting for federal property. The whole proceeds of the day, he wrote, had consequently exploded, amounting to about 125,000 of .71 and .54 small arm cartridges, and 175 rounds of field ammunition assorted for 12-pounder and 10-pounder Parrott guns. He continued, "The civil authorities of Pittsburgh and Lawrenceville," he noted, "had today made preparation for the interment of the bodies." That was the report. The Arsenal commander, the morning after burying his workers, counted the inventory. The burial took place on the afternoon of September 18th. The federal government provided 39 black coffins. The mayors of Pittsburgh and Lawrenceville attended. Clergy and council members watched as each coffin was lowered into a vast common grave donated by Allegheny Cemetery, a few miles from the Arsenal grounds. 54 of the 78 bodies could not be identified. They had been torn apart by the explosions, burned beyond recognition by the fire, or buried under collapsed walls in pieces that no family member could claim. They went into the trench together, names unknown, ages unknown, daughters of someone, somewhere, who would never be sure which body was hers to mourn. Let that sink in. More than 2/3 of the dead were so destroyed by the explosions that not even their own parents could identify them. The country barely noticed. On that same September 17th, in the Maryland cornfield along Antietam Creek, roughly 23,000 soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. 3,650 were dead on the field. The Pittsburgh newspapers carried the Arsenal story on the front page that week. The national press carried Antietam exclusively. By the time the country looked up from McClellan's failure to pursue Lee's retreating army, the funeral at Allegheny Cemetery was over and the laboratory rubble was already being cleared for reconstruction. The federal arsenal that had killed its own children on the bloodiest day of the war went back into production within days. The civilian coroner's inquest convened the same evening as the explosion. Witnesses were called from among the surviving workers, the supervisors, the wagon drivers, the powder magazine staff. They testified for days. What they described was consistent. Reused DuPont kegs, leaking powder onto a macadamized road. Iron-shod horses crossing that road dozens of times per day. A superintendent who had warned about exactly this scenario in writing. A commanding officer who had overruled the warnings. The coroner's jury issued its verdict in early October. The accident, the jury ruled, had been the result of the negligent conduct of Colonel John Symington and his subordinates in allowing loose powder to accumulate on the roadway and elsewhere. 3 men were named as criminally negligent: Symington himself, his subordinate Lieutenant John Eady, and Alexander McBride. Symington rejected the verdict. He claimed bias. He pointed to the rumors that had circulated about his loyalty. His son in the Confederate Army, his daughter's rosette, the gossip that had followed him through Pittsburgh for months. The civilian jury, he argued, had not weighed evidence. It had weighed suspicion. He demanded a military court of inquiry under Army jurisdiction to clear his name. The military court convened later that October. Many of the same witnesses appeared. Many of them changed their testimony. The discrepancies between the civilian and military hearings were extensive enough that historians have spent the century and a half since trying to reconstruct what was actually said the first time around. The military board concluded that the cause of the explosion could not be satisfactorily ascertained. Colonel Symington was found to have followed all precautions correctly. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. Less than a month later, the Army quietly relieved him of command anyway. Symington went on sick leave through 1862 and 1863. He retired from active service on June 1, 1863, after more than 45 years on the Army Register. He drew his pension. He died in 1864, a year before the war ended, with his record formally clean. Alexander McBride stayed at the Arsenal until the war ended. The civilian jury had blamed him alongside Symington. The military court had ignored him entirely. He kept his job, kept his pay, and kept walking past the rebuilt laboratory every day. He had lost his daughter in a disaster he had spent the previous year trying to prevent. He went on supervising cartridge production for the Army that had killed her. They retired Symington and kept McBride. That speaks loudly. The Arsenal kept producing. Temporary buildings went up within weeks of the explosion. A new permanent laboratory replaced the destroyed one. By 1863, the Allegheny Arsenal was back at full output. By the end of the war, it had produced tens of millions of cartridges for Union soldiers. The institution that had killed its own workers absorbed the loss as a line item and continued operating exactly as before. After 1865, the federal weapons system consolidated. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia and Watervliet Arsenal in New York absorbed the bulk of post-war ammunition production. Allegheny declined through the late 19th century. Fewer contracts, smaller workforce, aging machinery. The federal government formally closed it in 1907 and transferred most of the grounds to the city of Pittsburgh. Here's what happened in between. In the late 1890s, more than 30 years after the explosion, Alexander McBride was an old man living in Lawrenceville, within walking distance of his daughter's grave. He gathered 300 former Arsenal workers and surviving family members. They signed a petition to the United States Congress requesting $30,000 in compensation for the families of the 78 dead. $30,000, less than $400 per dead worker, 4 decades after the fact. Congress denied the petition. The official reason was that the money was needed to finance the Spanish-American War. Read that again. The institution that had killed children manufacturing ammunition for one war refused to compensate those deaths because it needed the money to manufacture ammunition for the next war. McBride died not long after. He never received a federal acknowledgement that his daughter's death had been preventable. He never received an apology from the Army that had cleared the man who overruled his warnings. He died in the same neighborhood where Katie was buried, in the shadow of an institution that had closed its files on her decades earlier. Walk through Arsenal Park in Lawrenceville today. The powder magazine of 1814 still stands beside the baseball diamond, used by the city as a storage shed for groundskeeping equipment. A few miles away in Allegheny Cemetery, a granite monument erected in 1928 marks the mass grave. Catherine Burkhart's family could mourn her by name. Margaret Turney's family could mourn her by name. 54 families could not. The Arsenal was bought corrupt, run loose, defended by a military court that cleared the responsible man while convicting the one who tried to prevent it, and forgotten by a Congress that needed the funeral money for the next war. The country moved on. The grave did not. The powder magazine still stands. The girls do not.